further ado, I have the distinct honor of introducing my colleague, Dr. James Hundley, who is an assistant professor here in the anthropology department and has been at Rowan since, another very important year, 2020. So he came to us from Binghamton University, where he both did his PhD, as well as taught and directed helped direct the global studies concentration. And his research comes with many accolades attached to it. The research that he'll be presenting here today, for example, was funded by many institutions, some very notable ones being the Russell Sage Foundation, the Wenner Gren Foundation, and the Whatcom Museum Foundation, just to name a few. I'd take his whole talk to list all of them. And in addition to this book, he's published 6 peer-review articles in journals such as Canadian Geographies, the American Review of Canadian Studies, as well as the Journal of Borderland Studies. But today he will in fact be talking about his recently published book in just January of this year, We Are Coast Salish, which explores the lives of the Coast Salish First Nations of the Pacific Northwest and the various ways they respond to the challenges of navigating the Canadian-US border following these events of 9/11. James has done amazing ethnographic research that I've been so lucky to hear about over the past 5 years, and I'm grateful that he'll be able to share with everybody else here today as well. So without further ado, I'd invite the people standing to one of the many seats at the front of the room to join us and pass over the literal and figurative microphone to you. We'll have about 45 minutes of a talk, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A as well.
Great. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you. I'd like to thank Dr. Sharnak and Dr. Haig and the Holly Bush Institute for inviting me and letting me speak about this book that I published, a long labor of love that we will learn about right now. So before I begin, I'm going to read a story as well, but before I begin, I want to start with a statement that I am not Indigenous, and I do not speak on behalf of the Coast Salish people. I am a Hualitam, an outsider, who benefited from the knowledge of many, many people. I also want to honor what my Coast Salish teachers taught me by acknowledging that we are assembled here on the territory of the Lenape Nation. Every tribal gathering I attended in the Pacific Northwest began with what we might call a land acknowledgement, even if only Native people were present. And I want to continue practicing what I learned years ago. So, about this image. They say when Howells came down from the mountains, he forgot to do something. He left the sky very, very low. The sky was not way up there. The sky was dark and heavy and way down here. It was right here. And because of that, the people walked around all bent over all the time. And they walked around like this. This is how they walked, bent over. Because if they stood up, they would bump their heads on the sky. So the people walked bent over all the time. Now, it's not fun walking like this. You keep bumping your head on the sky. Your back starts to hurt. You can't see where you're going and can only see your feet beneath you. And so the sky was dark and heavy upon the people, and they walked bent over. After a while, the people began to argue all the time. What are you laughing at? You don't know anything better than me. Mind your own business. They began to fight. Hey, you bumped your head into me. You made me bump my head in the sky. Stay out of my way. The people were always fighting and arguing. Is this helping our people? Of course not. Well, there was a little girl sitting in her house there. She saw this and said, this isn't right. My people are always arguing and fighting. I think it's because the sky is too dark and heavy upon us. There must be something I can do. And so the little girl thought, and she thought, and she thought some more, and she had an idea. She walked out of her house in the middle of the village, and she put her hands up to the sky, and she pushed as hard as she could, and she felt the sky move a tiny bit. She said, I know, if I invite other people out of their houses and we push together, maybe we can push up a little more. And she called the people out and told them her plan, but they were grumpy. Oh, that's a crazy idea. That'll never work. She said, oh, please, just try once. And they said, all right. So they all put their hands on the sky, and they pushed up as hard as they could, and they felt the sky move up a little bit more. Now, this was a very smart little girl. She said, I know, if we invite all the Native people from around here to come to our village, if we invite all the tribes from around here, to come to our village, and we all push up the sky together, maybe we could push the sky up and out of our way. We could push it up to where it belongs. And the people said, now, little girl, that's a very good idea. And so all the tribes from the Snoqualmie villages up in the mountains and the families explained how we're going to push up the sky. Everyone agreed, and it was a good idea, but someone from the back yelled out, there's a big problem here. We all have a different word for push. So how can we work together if we can't tell each other when to push because we have different words? The people talked and thought and talked and argued. How can we work together without this word that we can say in common? So the people know in this story, as we should know today, if you have a big problem that you haven't solved, that you go to an elder, an old person. Old people are not just smart, they are also wise. They've lived a long time, and they know how to solve big problems. So they went to an old man at the edge of the village, and they explained the problem to him. He said, let me think about it for 2 days. Come back in 2 days, and I will tell you. In 2 days, the people came back, and the old man said, you should use the word yahau. Yahau means push together. Yahau means we work together. When I say yahau, we all say yahau and push up on the heavy sky. The people pushed up, but it wasn't high enough. So people got big poles and used them to push up the sky using the same word, yahau. And they did it. They pushed the sky up to where it is today. This story, these are the first words that someone will read when they open my book. I wanted the first words and ideas to come from an Indigenous scholar. Storytellers are Indigenous scholars, and the story is an example of a traditional Coast Salish history, an ancient history, something called a Shwakwiam in the Halkomelem language. The story was told to me by Roger Fernandez of the Lower Elwha-Klallam Nation, though the story itself comes from the Snoqualmie Nation. I was attending a public gathering where he shared this story. After the event, he and I got to talking, and I explained who I was and why I was there, and we spoke about this story and the theme of coming together. And in his telling of this story to me and granting me permission to use it was premised on my ability to accurately reflect the story and its origin. So who are the Coast Salish? The term is not an Indigenous term itself, but now refers to the nearly 80 different First Nations and tribes that live around the Salish Sea from that first map on the intro slide. There are numerous languages and language families because of inter-village ties across the region through marriage and other connections, so most people were multilingual. One of the earlier settler scholars to work with the Coast Salish wrote that networks of intermarriage and cooperation in economic and ceremonial activities among neighboring tribes, regardless of language, made the whole Coast Salish region a kind of social continuum. And this very much continues into the present, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on the next slide. But why now? I first began working with the Coast Salish in some form nearly 20 years ago now. The international border with Canada was still undergoing changes from the events of 9/11. There was a lot of palpable fear, even in non-native borderland communities as well, that families would be divided, economies might suffer. There was fear that languages would be under threat even more, and that ceremonies that require participants from both sides of the border might decline or disappear. The Coast Salish were already preempting some of those changes by strengthening their social, cultural, and economic connections. But what was new was the political dimension and their use of language that started to mirror that of the nation state. Instead of solely referring to themselves as individual tribal nations on either side of the international border, they began to refer to themselves as the Coast Salish Nation, which is an explicit attempt to erase the international border as a colonial presence in their lives. So this book chronicles some of the ways that they've done this, and how they've built upon their own histories to do that. I also show how their response to securitization at the border mirrors their centuries-long resistance to settler colonialism more broadly. Defining who is and is not Coast Salish is not a particularly simple task. One way roughly corresponds to those whose territory is around the Salish Sea. So what you see here are Coast Salish people, but some of the folks on the kind of west side of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State are also Coast Salish. Across the landscape are markers from ancient times of the transformers, or hahals, that are from the story about pushing the sky up. These are powerful entities who came to this land and changed it into what we see today. One of these locations is Leithlake, also known as Mount Cheam, which is right here, in the Fraser River Valley. Leithlake was a Stalo ancestor who returned home and was turned to stone. She now stands watch over the Fraser River, over the people of the river, and the fish that swim up the river to feed them, continuing to protect them today. The story of Leithlake was told by Mrs. Cooper of the Suwali Nation and was told to me by Sonny McCalsey, who was the cultural advisor and historian for the Stalo Resource and Research Management Center. There are many sites like this, imbued with a very deep history and very rich in cultural knowledge across the entire region, too large in number for me to think about naming here. Locations like this are an important part of the social geography for the Coast Salish, and these are places that provide an intimate connection with lands across the region. Only the Coast Salish have transformer stories. Their neighbors in any direction may have trickster stories, often involving raven or coyote, but only the Coast Salish have transformer stories that therefore connect the land with those who live there. So knowing these Shwakwiyam, the Halkomelem term for their ancient history, gives a different perspective on the land itself. Lessons are taught through many stories, and since these stories are written into the landscape, if one knows that story, then traveling throughout the region is a constant reminder of the values that one ought to live by. These stories and the landscape that contains them is not defined by the nation state or the international border that divides them. This image then, here on the right, allows someone standing on the U.S. side of the border to reflect on the lessons connected to the Shwakwiyam of Leithlake. The spot of this photograph is in Lummi and Nooksack territory, but because they're part of that broader Coast Salish continuum, this Stalo story reverberates across the region, connecting all of those that know this particular history. This is another way of discussing who the Coast Salish are. This map comes from the Burke Museum in Seattle and shows many of the tribes and First Nations, along with the languages and language families that cover the region. As I said, there are nearly 80 different tribes and First Nations that are recognized in Washington and BC, though taking federal recognition as the marker itself leaves out other tribal nations as well, so it's only a partial picture. All of these nations have been and still are interconnected through marriage and kinship, through trade, through religious ceremonies, and many others. While there are other ways of defining who the Coast Salish are, for our purposes, this gives us a sense of where we're talking about and a glimpse into who they are as a distinct nation. And as I said before, Coast Salish as a term is not a native one. It was coined by anthropologists over a century ago when we covered the continent looking to categorize people and label them in ways that made sense to settlers. Indigenous peoples had other terms. For instance, along the Fraser River, the Stalo nations refer to themselves as Stalo, which means people of the river. Huelmuk is a term that refers not just to an indigenous person, but someone with a connection to the Coast Salish landscape. And the last term I've already used is Huelidum, which translates as hungry people, which originally referred to settlers who had an insatiable appetite for land and resources, but now refers to non-natives who reside in the area. So when speaking about the Coast Salish, particularly because I'm referring to them as a single nation, it is paramount that I reflect the tremendous linguistic and cultural diversity across the region. So we can think of Coast Salish as a sort of umbrella term, but one that doesn't homogenize everything that's underneath it. There's one historical example that I want to use that came up frequently when I was conducting research. These are both two maps of a place called Maple Bay. The left one here shows the location of Maple Bay on the east side of Vancouver Island. The map on the right just shows that bay in a little bit more detail. So when the world was still in chaos, before it is the way it is now, a snake fell into Maple Bay from the sky. The Cowichan people paddled into the bay and defeated the monster, taking its spirit power. Another ancient story concerns a malevolent being who lived in the bay and would attack canoes as they paddled by, devouring them whole. In one version, the Transformers turned that monster to stone. In another version, a powerful warrior from across the sea hurled a boulder over that killed the monster after striking it. The landscape retains visual reminders of these tales. That boulder is still present today. And tribal nations across the region have similar stories connected to this particular site. More recently, the Battle of Maple Bay was a significant battle between an alliance of Coast Salish families from across the region and the Lekwaltok, who are part of the Kwakwaka'wakw people farther north, and their territory begins right around here. The Lekwaltok were known to raid the Coast Salish frequently. They decided to fight back. Leaders from all over came together to plan what to do. Two scouts saw hundreds of Lekwaltok raiders paddling into the bay. The Cowichan and their allies set a trap as the 300 canoes paddled into the bay where the Lekwaltok were waiting. This startled the raiders as they saw a gap near the north end of the bay and started to paddle frantically. The Cowichan anticipated this. Many of those canoes were empty in the water as decoys. They hid at the top of the bluffs overlooking the water, and as the Lekwaltok paddled by, they launched boulders, destroying all of the canoes. These stories are shared among many families. When two archaeologists collected oral histories from families, they included not just who told the story, but that the individual had the right to tell it. Lushim was one person whose great-grandfather was at this battle, and through him had the right to tell the story. It's now contained in an academic article, but is following the same protocol. I wanted to include this story for a few reasons. It shows the importance of both ancient history and recent family history together. It shows the power of places and the impact that these histories have on people today. Angelbeck and McLay, the two archaeologists who conducted those oral history interviews, conducted those interviews at Maple Bay itself. They brought people to the bay. It also works to show that it wasn't, quote, the Coast Salish Navy that worked to repel these attackers. The Coast Salish have always been autonomous and have never had a centralized decision-making body. Yet this battle is one of the few historical instances of widespread political cooperation among the Coast Salish, at least according to Angelbeck and McLay. So why now? One of those questions from the earlier slide. What makes the Coast Salish story fascinating to me is how they are responding to post-9/11 security concerns in a similar manner to the Lekwaltok invaders from nearly a century and a half ago. Let's travel back in time to September 10th, 2001. Their territory was still split by the Canada-US border, but people crossed with relative ease. Border agents would often joke with people that, oh, you're going to be late to the canoe race, or I haven't seen you in a while, where have you been? The next day changed everything. The border was shut down after the terrorist attacks, and while 9/11 itself wasn't responsible for introducing new security measures at the border, it certainly accelerated what was already there. New technologies of control were adopted. New forms of surveillance were implemented. New documents were required to cross. The sheer size and scope of border agencies expanded. For a nation divided by a border, this posed a significant problem, and I moved there and spent approximately 2 years asking how this increasing securitization was impacting Coast Salish practices, behaviors, and ideologies. I lived in Nooksack and Stallo communities. I traveled in a canoe up the Washington and British Columbia coasts. I attended public and private meetings. I visited archives and museums throughout the region, interviewing as many people as I could. So knowing a little bit about who and where the Coast Salish are, and understanding how they have always been autonomous, there are 3 illustrative case studies that I want to describe that they are all coming together under one banner of being the Coast Salish Nation. They're declaring we are Coast Salish as a way of mitigating some of those detrimental impacts that they faced at the border following security policies implemented after 9/11. One of those concerns anti-pipeline protests in British Columbia, often referred to as the Thin Green Line, that stands in the way of fossil fuels. The second is an organization called the Coast Salish Gathering that seeks to co-manage the Salish Sea for environmental sustainability. And the last is the Canoe Journey, an annual gathering of tribal nations from across the entirety of the Northwest Coast. One of the things about ethnographic research is that we may start with a particular question in mind, but the question that matters to people on the ground can sometimes be very different. I started wanting to know more about securitization, a term that made people's eyes glaze over and still does. What I found was that they were explaining their differences, their experiences regarding settler colonialism. They made sense of their changing world through settler colonialism. So I could not do ethnography without seeing this changing world through their eyes as well. And what I discovered was that their responses to this securitization problem was very, very similar to what they had been doing for the past 200 years in responding to settler colonialism. The Pacific Northwest is home to a significant population, tens of millions of people, and for many, environmental sustainability is a top priority. Many have a kind of stereotype of being environmental hippies in the Northwest. While I attended numerous protests, those that were fighting against the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion are perhaps the most illustrative. So there's an existing pipeline that connects the tar sands of Alberta, here in the map, with Burnaby, which is just outside of Vancouver. And in Burnaby, the bitumen is loaded onto oil tankers and then shipped overseas. And the pipeline owners, what they wanted to do was to triple the capacity of oil coming from the tar sands into Vancouver. And again, I do want to point out there's a danger in homogenizing any peoples. There were some tribal nations that supported the pipeline. Most First Nations rejected it, though, and they used a lot of unique efforts to gain public support and to use their clout to push back. This bottom image here is from the signing of an international treaty by countless First Nations across Canada and the US, not just within the region. They asserted that the pipeline was violating not just Canadian law, but their law as well, particularly because most of the land in British Columbia is unceded territory. They used the treaty to present a unified voice in opposition to the pipeline and to challenge the hegemony of the Canadian state. First Nations law on unceded First Nations territory should matter too. Another novel strategy they used was presenting testimony before the Canada Energy Regulator. This is the body that regulates and manages pipelines that cross provincial borders in Canada. While First Nations have often presented testimony in the past at for these hearings, what was new for the Trans Mountain Pipeline was that 5 U.S. tribes were granted intervenor status, something that had never happened before. And 4 of those tribes were Coast Salish. I spoke with their lawyer who represented them, who explained that they intentionally applied as Coast Salish, not as 4 distinct tribal nations, because of their shared kinship and those connections that created a shared homeland across the region that kind of negated the impact of the international border itself. So by applying as Coast Salish, they avoided the pitfalls of having to reference the international border, which would have placed them outside the jurisdiction of Canada. During the hours of testimony that I observed, elders and elected leaders from across the Salish Sea explained the devastating impacts that the pipeline would have. These leaders drew heavily on their ancient and family histories, weaving together stories and families that in some cases took hours and was a masterclass in the art of storytelling as a historian. Every elected representative, historian, or elder was so skillful in weaving together their Shuaquiam and Squelquel, their ancient histories and family histories, and how they united nations from across the entire region as though the border was not there. Even the bureaucrats who led these meetings as representatives of the Canadian government recognized the significance of this testimony and the inclusion of the Coast Salish from both sides of the border. While ultimately unsuccessful in stopping the expansion of that pipeline, they came together in such a way that they resisted the dominance of the government. There was some hope during these protests as well. There was a major Canadian Supreme Court decision that was released that shifted the balance of power that now requires the government to move from simply having a duty to consult towards something closer of requiring consent. It's not perfect, there's still a long way to go, but that decision was huge and is still being celebrated. Back in 2005, leaders from across the region recognized that there were gaps in how Washington and British Columbia were working to protect and restore the Salish Sea. At the time, maps showed Puget Sound in American waters and the Gulf of Georgia in Canadian waters, despite being part of the same body of water. Elders and political leaders sought to find an ecosystem-based governance strategy that recognized the unity of the Salish bioregion. This was an Indigenous-led project that utilized a decentralized governance based on their own ancient history. One person I interviewed described the work of this gathering and said, quote, "Our culture has taken a hit by the border. The gathering is a way of trying to revert back to the old days when there was no border." A year or two later, they renamed this the Coast Salish Gathering to reflect that unified approach to working to protect the region. They would invite government representatives from Environment Canada or the EPA to observe and participate, but it was an Indigenous event. 5 years after that, so around 2009 and 10, those bodies of water were formally renamed by both Washington and British Columbia and the US and Canada to be the Salish Sea, kind of an acknowledgement that this was one bioregion. After the Coast Salish Gathering's second annual meeting, they released a statement, and it said, "The border and the governance issues has separated the alliance of Coast Salish tribes and First Nations, which has resulted in loss of the control of policy development in our homelands. The Coast Salish tribes and nations have restarted the alliance of knowledge, strength, and support to regain their rightful places as owners of the land, water, and air of the shared ecoregion. One nation, one ecoregion, one policy, one plan." Their own internal documents shifted from using Coast Salish nations, in the plural, to saying the Coast Salish nation, in the singular. They worked to come together to speak with one voice so that the federal, state, and provincial governments could not ignore them. The renaming of the Salish Sea by the governments also enabled the broader public to recognize that if there is a transnational body of water that is one, then the Coast Salish people who live on its shores are also one. During their meetings, and this continues to the present, the first day is dedicated not to policy issues or discussing ecosystem problems. The first day, people stand up, introduce themselves, and finish by saying, "And I am Coast Salish," in order to build connections among the group. The elders that I interviewed about these gatherings were quick to remind me that while they were asserting this shared identity, I am Coast Salish, they were still not a central government. That this gathering was not a formal government that issued mandates. It was an alliance without a central leader, something that they had been doing for millennia. And this way of working continues into the present. The final example I want to share is a now annual event on the Northwest Coast. Again, hopefully the images are bright enough that we can see them. But imagine standing on the rocky shore in the small village of Waglisla, or Bella Bella. The town normally has a population of about 1,500. In the morning, you stand there and see 50 canoes, completely full of canoe pullers from hundreds and hundreds of miles away. Over the next 4 or 5 hours, each canoe paddles forward. Its skipper stands. They explain who they are, that they've paddled for weeks or a month or longer to be there. They're tired and hungry and want to come ashore to share their songs and dances. The elders on the beach respond and grant them permission and welcome them to come celebrate with them. When this event began is unclear. I've written about the origins of the journey before. Some said it was the World's Fair in 1986 when Vancouver hosted. Others said, no, it was the 1989 Paddle to Seattle that commemorated Washington's centennial. Some others said the inklings of the journey were actually in the 1970s on the Washington coast. But what's common across those stories is that there was pressure by state agents throughout the 19th and well into the 20th centuries to suppress indigenous cultures, and that the canoe was a key to its reprisal. One of the most well-known figures in the canoe journey world was Emmett Oliver of the Quinault Nation, one of the primary organizers of the 1989 Washington Centennial that included, at his insistence, an indigenous presence. He stated that reconnecting Native communities to canoe travel could lead to a restoration of their cultural identities. He was right. One year, I stood on the beach at Quinault and watched 100 canoes line up. The image here only has 50 because Bella Bella is incredibly far away. And it represents kind of the time and cost commitment to participate is also quite substantial, especially when you're spending a month on the water. I also want to thank the photographer David Moskowitz for taking this photo. One of the challenges at times of doing ethnography is it's hard to document certain things when you're actively participating. So for the journey, each day during the summer, the journey grows. A canoe family paddles to the neighboring tribe, they're formally received, they share songs and dances, and the next morning, the journey grows by one. Each stop gains momentum as canoe family after canoe family join and paddle to the next host. The final stop is the host nation, and a week-long celebration in Potlatch where the host nation gives gifts to thank those for coming. This was the canoe family I traveled with to Bella Bella. Our skipper, an elder of the Snohomish tribe, is standing, his hand raised to thank the host for allowing us to land. Spending weeks in the canoe gave me the chance to speak with him about the journey, literally a very captive audience. He had participated with the journey since it became an annual event in the 1990s, and every year since then. He told me how it had changed over time and why each and everything they do is meaningful. He told me about the ways youth are growing up only knowing canoe culture, which is something I saw in other areas of my research too. He graciously allowed me to participate fully. I'm the one there with the red bandana in the canoe, but I wore their regalia. I danced with them every time they danced. I paddled every day, helping the canoe to get to the next landing spot. As a group, we suffered sore muscles and joints together and celebrated each night together. And I was involved in one way or another with the canoe journey across 4 different summers. The first 2 as an observer only, very much an outsider. The second 2 very much as a participant of a canoe family. This is an image of the big house of the Coast Salish First Nation when they hosted us one night on the journey. This was a big feast. We would later wear our regalia and dance around the fire in the middle of the floor. This gave everyone a chance to interact and mingle, a very social event. One elder I interviewed months later described the journey as a sort of political training ground, because the youth that participate are being raised knowing their traditional protocol. They're making connections and relationships that will ultimately allow them to move into important positions as they get older. As an aside for me, as an anthropologist, the journey to Bella Bella was like revisiting some graduate school readings. When I first walked into this big house, I recognized it instantly. There's a black and white photograph of those same carved posts from Franz Boas in the 1880s, these very same posts. But his image was strikingly different than this one. It's not because this is a vibrantly colored picture and his was black and white, but Boas's picture had no people. It was a stale image with no life, whereas this image shows a bustling and vivacious gathering. The canoe journey was one way that tribes and First Nations are reprising their culture. And I use the word reprise rather than revitalize because these traditions never died and are not being reborn. They've always been there, though suppressed because of colonial policies prohibiting much of what they had traditionally done. So these practices are not just returning, but they are growing, they are thriving. And one of the major insights I received from interviewing elders who had been involved with this journey since its inception was the near exponential rate of growth beginning in 2002. That fear of being separated after 9/11 prompted leaders to work together to make sure they were strong enough to withstand any potential obstacles from changing government policies. And I wish I had the actual statistics for how many people participated each year. Sadly, those don't exist. But from their accounts, after 2002, it was massively growing. While the focus for many was on the canoe itself, and people really relished their opportunity to spend 8 to 12 hours a day paddling across the Salish Sea, I found the downtime to be equally memorable. So this is an image from Fort Rupert, the home of the Coast Salish First Nation. They expected to host all of the canoe pullers for one night. After that first night, the next morning we woke at 3 a.m. to haul the 800-pound canoe down the rocky shore, standing there in the cold, waiting for the weather report from the support boat. It was too dangerous to cross. So we hauled the canoe back up the shore. We tried again the next morning. 3 a.m., we're on the beach, groggy, carrying the canoe down. Too dangerous. So we go back. In the meantime, the Kwakiuth had only planned to host us all for one night. They ended up having us for 3, housing us and feeding us. They were incredibly gracious hosts. This picture, again, is of the big house. You can see salmon cooking over fire on sticks there. At night, the sand floor and the wooden bleachers filled up with tired canoe pullers and sleeping bags, and we were lulled to sleep by the sounds of drumming and singing. I referred to the week at the end of the journey as a potlatch. This is a term that describes the way that nations across the Northwest Coast would redistribute wealth among a community. Rather than hoarding wealth to increase status, which is common in our society, First Nations would gather goods, often for years, and commemorate important events by inviting people from far and wide and giving away the wealth that they had acquired. Doing this increased their status and prestige, which was much more valuable than having that wealth acquired through the acquisition of objects. Receiving a gift at a potlatch was also not solely about just getting a gift. Potlatches were often commemorating an important event, and those in attendance who were witnesses were required to remember what happened. So their gift at a potlatch was a payment for their memory. One of the most valuable items that could be given away is something called a copper. This picture here on the right, which is very hard to see right now, is a photo from Edward Curtis of a Kwakiuth man holding a copper, and you can kind of see the shape here. So again, having this copper was a sign of his prestige. Giving it away was a massive display. The image here on the left, though, is from the paddle to Bella Bella. Instead of a copper made of actual copper, the host gave each canoe family a wooden one. The design is roughly the same. You can see it kind of flares out at the top, is rounded, and comes together in the middle more. There's a ridge. This one's painted in the middle, whereas this ridge is there in copper. So the design, again, is roughly the same. The symbolism, though, is what was important. To be gifted a copper, even if it's just a wooden one, and these were nearly 6 feet tall and several inches thick, it was a significant gesture. I still don't know how the canoe families got these back home with them because they were massive. And similarly, at the end of the week, every single tribal nation canoe family has the opportunity to present their songs and dances. The last one to go is the host nation. The Hiltsuk Nation, who hosted Bella Bella, took the floor around 5 p.m. and they offered their songs. They concluded around 6 or 7 in the morning by wrapping a blanket around the shoulders of everybody in attendance. Again, wrapping a blanket around somebody is a powerful and meaningful gesture that thanked all of us for paddling hundreds of miles to be there with them. This is one way that culture is being reprised. Canoes are now arriving on shores across the region as they had in the past. Children are excited about learning their families' dances. Elders smile when youth speak their native language, even if it's just a greeting. The logistics of planning the canoe journey are incredibly vast. It takes a year to plan for the next journey, and it can take years for the host nation to plan and prepare for receiving. But in 2015, there was no formal host. So instead, there were 2 different canoe journeys on either side of the border. The one on the American side focused on youth. This year, each time a canoe landed, it was a youth who stood up and made that request to come ashore. It was an intentional attempt by all of the US-based tribes to continue the education of their youth. And that includes knowing how to ask for permission to enter the territory of their neighbors, and it includes knowing the appropriate protocol for receiving guests into your territory. In 2015, I traveled with the Nooksack canoe family, which is pictured here. This was us landing on the shores of the Swinomish Nation, who had hosted the journey in 2011. They had about 10,000 visitors when they hosted. The Swinomish built 3 gazebos on the shores in the shape of cedar hats. And again, I'm not quite sure how easy it would be to see, but this is a cedar hat, a kind of traditional Coast Salish cedar bark weaving art. In 2013, the Quinault Nation hosted and raised a totem pole to commemorate the event. So many hosts will mark the journey in some way like this, building fairly large projects. And those markers remain well after the conclusion. They serve as visual reminders about their connection to one another and the power behind the canoe journey in reprising these practices. I interviewed one Nooksack citizen who had participated in the early years of the journey when she was quite young. So while she was telling me about her upbringing, she said that it was through the canoe journey that she learned what it meant to be Coast Salish. She grew up Nooksack, and that is very much a part of her identity today. But being Coast Salish as a shared transnational identity came to her through the journey. And during the journey, the canoe is often described as a floating classroom because the skipper is able to teach about the importance of each place that they travel through, and recalling that countless stories and histories are written into the landscape. Traveling by canoe is a way of encountering those lessons where they actually happened. The different examples I present in my book, the canoe journey, the Coast Salish gathering, and environmental protests surrounding the pipeline, are all interrelated. Weaving, like the cedar weaving in this photo, is central to much Coast Salish life, and it shaped how I understood their world after 9/11. I see these different examples as being integrated and reinforcing one another. For instance, in an effort to gather data about water quality, the Coast Salish Gathering partnered with the canoe journey. A canoe, being without a motor, is an ideal vessel for doing water sampling along the shared waters of the Salish Sea. Motorized boats couldn't do it, and the EPA and Environment Canada could only do one side of the border. Those involved with environmental protest, particularly the Sacred Trust Initiative, which is part of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, had a presence at the Paddle to Bella Bella journey. Organizers told me that the journey itself tries to stay as apolitical as possible, but for many people, the health of the environment is connected to cultural identity and cannot avoid being political. And in their testimony before the Canada Energy Regulator, elected leaders and elders spoke of their youth and how they're learning their responsibility to one another and to the land through events like the canoe journey. So for me, these weren't three distinct examples, that they are all interconnected cases that strengthen one another. I wrote this book in part because Indigenous peoples are often left out of the way that scholars analyze the world in which we live. We often examine, quote, the Indigenous world as though it's separate somehow. But there are others who can learn from their experiences in the borderlands. Nation states are still responding to and shaping global processes that include transnational social movements. Movements like Idle No More, the COVID-19 protests that shut down the Canada-US border for a while, and climate change are but a few examples of how anthropologists can tell the story of those whose lives are impacted and those whose lives impact these issues. This image here represents how many perceive the border today. There's an obelisk right here, one of over 5,500 that line the border, clearly marking which side is which. But there's also law enforcement from each country, along with infrared cameras and other surveillance. For many Coast Salish, their world, and the borderlands more broadly, remain under constant watch. And for some, their very indigeneity at times poses a threat to the state. When discussing political issues that involve governments and security, it's often tempting to assume that the nation state is the primary or most relevant container for scholarly analysis. It isn't. It excludes too much. The nation state still matters in our world, absolutely, but the assumption that it's the natural or worse, only political entity to focus on is partly to blame for Indigenous citizens being treated merely as ethnic minorities rather than as political nations in their own right. One of the arguments I put forth in the book is to treat Indigenous epistemologies or ways of knowing as just as legitimate as Western ways. I implore Western scholars to include Indigenous knowledge as knowledge and to use it in how we theorize borders, which will have implications beyond the Pacific Northwest. And as I wrap up, it's important that as a settler scholar, it's not my role to resolve the problems created by colonization. Decolonization is an Indigenous-led process. Settlers shouldn't invite Indigenous peoples to the table, they should invite us. When I wrote this book, I wanted an Indigenous history to be the first words that the reader encounters. One of the intended audiences of this book are border studies scholars, not necessarily or exclusively critical Indigenous studies scholars or other anthropologists. For me, border studies and anthropology are stronger when they include Indigenous ways of knowing. Research in the Pacific Northwest should always contend with the Coast Salish, whether it's anthropology and border studies, or environmental science, or another discipline entirely. It's also important to recognize, too, that the Coast Salish world extends beyond the impositions and obstacles of the international border and the challenges of settler colonialism. A broader point I make in the book, too, and some of my other articles, is that the Coast Salish world, and indeed social worlds for all of us, have been affected in many ways by ideological changes that have reshaped the international border, and securitization is but one of those changes. One of the ways the Coast Salish have responded to those impositions is to highlight their own ancient history and to use it as they maintain and expand their cross-border connections. In many ways, they work to erase the international border, at least as a settler colonial relic that continues to work against them. And I wanted to use this book as an opportunity to celebrate those activists who have worked to improve life in the borderlands. So I want to conclude by returning to this story, the Yahoo story. I see it as a contemporary story. Today, the Coast Salish have come together like they did with this historical example. They have worked together to resist many of the negative impacts of securitization on their nations and communities. But I've argued that instead of saying Yahoo to do that, they currently say, we are Coast Salish, but the effect is largely the same. So to conclude, this says Yalyak Kwasoy, which means not just thank you, but a very sincere gratitude for coming and listening, and to the Coast Salish people who taught me everything that went into this book. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that riveting talk and this fascinating research process as well as research results. We do have a few minutes for questions. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and we just have to make sure that you talk into the microphone so that it can be recorded. So does anyone have any questions? I can also, as you guys are thinking of questions, I know it was so thorough, maybe I could start off with the first one. One of the things that you mentioned is not homogenizing the Coast Salish because there's so many different nations that comprise of them. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, especially about, as we think about divided and polarized societies, thinking about how they deal with, for example, diversity of opinions in how to respond to pipeline development or other kind of disagreements that you saw during your ethnographic research, and both what those were and then also potentially how they dealt with some of those disagreements.
Sure. So the pipeline example is a really good one, that along the entire stretch of the Trans Mountain Pipeline or other ones like the Keystone XL pipeline that was farther north, there were some tribal nations whose leadership voted to accept that, to work with the government, to work with these developers to build the pipeline. There were others who vehemently resisted, set up camps blocking this. The RCMP sent snipers to reinforce their control over the region, even though that land was unceded and they did not have the authority to do that. So that international treaty that I attended, there were some who protested it. Who has the authority to speak on behalf of a tribe was also something that came up a couple of times as well. There were some who thought that the elected leaders really didn't have the authority, kind of the cultural authority, to make that decision. They see the elected council as an imposition from the colonial government, which it very much was. Both Canada and the US forced tribes to adopt kind of municipal-style governments so they knew how to interact with them. But some tribes still have hereditary leaders who may not be elected, but whose voice carries a considerable amount of weight. And so if there was a case where the hereditary leader was against something, but the elected council was for it, there was a lot of division within the tribe if that happened. So again, no consensus. I don't want to say the Coast Salish did X or Y, because there were different tribes within that had differing opinions, and within one tribe, it's not a homogeneous thing either. So there's a lot of layers to disagreement.
That's great. Thank you so much. Does anybody else have a question?
I was going to ask, in what ways Coast Salish and cultural relevancy when it comes to policy making?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. So the year I was on the canoe journey in Bella Bella, it was in July of 2014. That's when the Supreme Court issued the the Chilcotin decision, which was that kind of landmark case that said the government doesn't just have to send a letter in the mail and say, look, we consulted, our job is done. But the Supreme Court said, no, you need to do more than that. You need to go closer towards getting consent. So that was a significant shift, and there was a massive celebration in Bella Bella about that. There was, I wouldn't call it a parade, but there was a field where people were celebrating, also using it as a protest against the Enbridge pipeline and then the Trans Mountain pipeline too. So that was one way, is that in particular British Columbia, within the Canadian context, because most of BC's land was not ceded, there are no treaties between the tribes and the government that said, we are signing away this territory in exchange for other things. The Supreme Court said, yeah, their claim, their right and title to that land still holds. So in the Canadian context, almost every major decision about Indigenous issues often comes out of British Columbia, because the ground is so shaky about how to proceed. They're currently negotiating treaties. Many tribes, many First Nations are still negotiating treaties, have been for decades. But because of that legal standing, their power is growing. And another more recent Supreme Court decision from Canada was that a US-based tribal nation does have certain claims within Canada as well. So the border, according to the Canadian Supreme Court, is blurring a little bit too, that they're recognizing that US-based tribes, because of their history of predating the border, they have certain claims against the government too.
Sure. Really appreciate the presentation, Dr. Hundley. I did have a question, and I might not be using the right vocabulary, but as somebody who's completing an ethnography, as a settler colonialist and a scholar, what was your experience with entree and resistance, and then perhaps acceptance and confidence, if those are proper terms? But what was that experience like, especially hearing you talk about the 4 years that you either observed or directly participated in that really important canoe journey?
Fantastic question. That first summer, my experience with the journey, I'll give a little bit more background about what that last week looks like. So the big formal landing where all the canoes line up and one by one ask for permission to come ashore takes anywhere from 4 hours with the Bella Bella one to about 8 hours with the Quinault one, because there were over 100 canoes. In 2012, that landing happened in Olympia, Washington. It was a big event. The governor came, she spoke, other leaders were there who also addressed people. And then the week-long celebration that followed was at the Squaxin Island tribes territory. So Olympia is in the middle of their territory, but the potlatch itself and that whole week was on their reservation. I only attended the landing, so I was there to see how people set up, kind of what the landing itself looks like, but I wasn't inside yet to be invited to the potlatch or to actually see it. The second year, I didn't travel with the canoe journey, I kind of followed them. So I drove around the Olympic Peninsula, stopping each time they stopped. I interviewed people, but I remember this one distinct moment because I was camping along with everybody else, but I was told, no, you have to camp on this side of the stream, not that side. This side is for the canoe journey people. This side is for you, because you're not a canoe journey person. The next year, I was part of that canoe family. The Blue Heron Canoe took me in, and I traveled with them. I was able to explain a little bit more about why I was there and what I was doing. And so a lot of people with the journey kind of saw me as an asset, and I don't think they had before. So because of that, I kind of had that entry point and from that moment on, the Blue Heron Canoe family year-round does things. The Snohomish tribe is not federally recognized, so they do a lot of public events to kind of force their way into the public imagination. Anytime I was somewhere, if they saw me, they'd be, no, you're coming on stage, like, come up with us. we'll give you a drum, put on our regalia, you're with us. And so that moment on, things were a little different. I was a full participant.
Any other questions? Well, if not, then maybe we can give one more big round of applause. Also, just want to mention that if you want to take your book out, I don't know if you have a copy. We have a few here. Unfortunately, the bookstore was unable to get copies in time, but Dr. Hundley ordered a few that he was willing to resell at author discount value if you're interested in both getting a copy and having it signed. I think maybe you'd be willing to do so.
Yes, very much. Hopefully it'll come out in paperback very soon because it'll be a lot.
Exactly. And we will make sure everybody knows about that, but otherwise it is available like on the web as well. So that and a last plug for our next event on October 23rd, but thank you so much for coming and thank you for this wonderful presentation. Have a great day.